Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in New York's Hudson Valley history. Before we start, please leave a comment telling us where you are and when you heard this story. We want to know where these documented accounts come from and when they come in. In 1920, the grand estate of Ravenscraft Manor stood on a cliff overlooking the Hudson River near Sleepy Hollow, New York. The Gothic revival style of the mansion, which was built in the late 1800s by businessman Montgomery Rotors, cast long shadows over its large grounds. The Rotors family made their money during the railroad boom by buying up huge amounts of Manhattan real estate before anyone could see how quickly the city would grow. By 1920, they were as rich as the Astors and Vanderbilts, but they tried to stay out of the public eye. The Rotors were different from other rich families who showed off their wealth through lavish parties and public acts of charity. They were more private and secretive. People knew that they turned down invitations to the most important events in New York City because they liked the quiet of their Hudson Valley estate. When they did go out into the world, they didn't leave much of an impression, as if they were practicing how to be both present and forgettable at the same time. The manor had 23 employees, all of whom were led by Prescott Hargrove, a strict Englishman who had worked for the family for almost 30 years. Hargrove came to Ravenscraft in 1893 with glowing recommendations from a well-known household in London. He was tall and thin, with deep-set eyes that missed nothing. He never talked about why he left England, and the staff quickly learned not to ask him about his past. People in the Hudson Valley knew Hargrove for being very loyal to the Rotors family and paying close attention to every little thing. He ran the house with an obsession-like level of detail, demanding nothing less than perfection from the footmen, maids, cooks, and groundskeepers. Under his watchful eye, Ravenscraft ran like a well-oiled machine, with each servant doing their job with clockwork-like accuracy. The staff quarters were in the west wing of the manor. This part of the house was much less fancy than the family's living areas, but it was still more comfortable than most servant quarters of the time. Hargrove lived in a private suite near the hallway that connected the family and staff areas. It was in a good spot between the two. His rooms were sparsely furnished, but they had a large personal library with books on household management, European history, and, strangely, a few books on esoteric philosophy that never got dusty, even though the household was kept very clean. Thaddeus Rotors, the head of the family, got the estate from his father Montgomery in 1912. Thaddeus, who was 56 years old, had the commanding presence that a man in his position should have. His dark hair had silver streaks in it, and his piercing gray eyes seemed to judge everyone's worth in dollars and cents. His deep, resonant voice sounded like someone who had never been questioned or contradicted before. He was respected by the staff, but not loved. He was friendly, but distant, and his work was always done quickly and efficiently. People knew his wife, Constance, was beautiful and had a lot of European art. She was 20 years younger than him. She was the daughter of a British diplomat. She met Thaddeus during a social season in London and married him after a short courtship that raised eyebrows in diplomatic circles. She was the picture of aristocratic grace, with her porcelain skin, auburn hair, and graceful movements. People who watched her closely, though, saw a certain emptiness behind her smile, as if she were always thinking about things she didn't say. They had 3 grown children. Vivian, the oldest, had married into another wealthy family. Augustus, the heir apparent to the family fortune, and Sylvia, the youngest at 24, had just come back from finishing school in Switzerland. Each child had some of their parents' looks and personalities, but they were all different in ways that showed how complicated the family was. Vivian Rotors Holly, who was 32 at the time, had made a name for herself in Manhattan society by marrying shipping magnate William Holly. She didn't go to Ravenscraft very often because her relationship with her father had cooled after she chose a husband who Thaddeus thought was new money without proper roots. Vivian moved through social circles with careful skill, keeping ties that helped her husband's business interests. She had her mother's beauty and her father's sharp mind. Augustus, 29, lived in the East Wing of Ravenscraft with his wife, Eleanor, a quiet woman from a respectable but poor family in Philadelphia. He helped his father run the family's many investments, which taught him the ins and outs of their financial empire. Augustus was tall and thin, like Thaddeus. He had his father's analytical mind, but he didn't have his commanding presence. He often let the older Rotors take charge in business and personal matters. The household staff noticed that Augustus had been copying his father's mannerisms with almost studied accuracy in recent years, as if he were consciously trying to become more like his father. The youngest Rotor child, Sylvia, had always been thought to be the most lively. Before she left for Switzerland in 1918, she was known for her lively laughter, artistic nature, and rebellious streak that sometimes pushed the limits of what was considered proper behavior in society. She was very good at music and languages, and her schooling was carefully planned to help her develop these skills. When she came back from Europe in early 1920, her family had a small gathering. After that, she became unusually quiet, which her servants said was because of the strict discipline she learned at her Swiss finishing school. The daily routines of the household followed patterns that had been in place for decades. Breakfast was served right on time at 7:30 a.m. in the morning room for Thaddeus, who always got up early, no matter what time of year it was. At 9 a.m., Marguerite, Constance's lady's maid, usually brought her breakfast in bed. Augustus and Eleanor had breakfast together in their private sitting room. Sylvia, on the other hand, often skipped breakfast altogether after she got back and came out of her rooms around noon. Thaddeus spent his mornings in his study, going over letters and financial reports that were sent to him by messenger from his New York office. In the afternoons, he met with business partners, either at Ravenscraft or in the city, depending on how important the issue was. The family usually had a formal dinner in the dining room at 8:00 the evening. After dinner, the men went to the library for brandy and conversation, while the women stayed in the drawing room. This carefully planned life looked like normal aristocratic life, but there were currents of tension and secrets running through Ravenscraft's halls. Servants talked in hushed tones about strange sounds coming from the sealed-off parts of the East Wing, about quiet arguments going on behind closed doors, and about visitors who came after dark and left before dawn. These whispers never went beyond the estate's wrought iron gates. They were kept inside by loyalty, fear, or maybe something worse. On Thursday, the 14th of October 1920, the family got ready for an important dinner party. The air was thick with autumn mist. Thaddeus had asked a few people from the banking industry to come and talk about a big investment opportunity. The staff worked hard under Hargrove's strict watch. The silver was polished until it shone like a mirror. The crystal glassware was arranged with mathematical precision, and the dining room became a showplace for wealth and taste. The menu, which had been planned weeks in advance, included seasonal dishes made by the French chef Monsieur Laurent. These included oysters, Rockefeller, clear turtle soup, roast pheasant with wild mushroom sauce, asparagus with hollandaise, and a charlotte russe for dessert. They had carefully counted the wines in the cellar and chosen specific vintages to go with each course. As night fell on Ravenscraft, something was clearly wrong. Hargrove, who was usually around a lot during preparations for events like this, hadn't been seen in over an hour. Mrs. Maria Winters, the head housekeeper, thought he was in the wine cellar taking care of last-minute details, like picking out the right wines for the evening's distinguished guests. She had worked for the family for 22 years. Mrs. Winters took care of the last details while the butler was away, and her worry grew as the minutes went by. It was very unusual for Hargrove to not show up for work, especially before such an important event. They sent one of the footmen to find him, but he came back empty-handed. The staff looked at each other with worry, their work slowing down without the butler's steady direction. The grandfather clock in the main hall said it was 6:42 p.m. when a scream echoed through the manor. It came from the library, where Sylvia Rotors had gone to pick out music for the evening's fun. The sound, high-pitched and raw with fear, cut through the quiet work of getting ready for the day like a knife. It looked like the grandfather clock's mechanism was having trouble, as if time itself was afraid of what had happened. The sound echoed off the marble floors and mahogany paneling, and everyone in the house froze in shock. Mrs. Winters was the first to get better. She told 2 footmen to go with her to find out what was going on. The other staff members were huddled together in the servants' hall, their faces pale and their voices low as they shared their fears and theories. When Mrs. Winters and the footmen got to the library, they saw Sylvia standing stiffly in front of her father's desk. Her face was pale, and her shaking hand was pointing to the floor behind it. Her pale blue silk evening gown stood out sharply against her pale skin. She didn't say anything. Her first scream had turned into a silence that was worse than any scream. Thaddeus Rotors was lying there, crumpled in an unnatural way, with a letter opener sticking out of his chest and his eyes wide open in shock. His white shirt and waistcoat were stained with blood, and the Persian carpet beneath him had a dark stain on it. His glasses were nearby, with one lens broken, as if he had taken them off just before he died. Mrs. Winters sent one footman to call the police and another to find Augustus. She walked up to Sylvia slowly and spoke to her in a soft voice, like you would to a scared child. Sylvia didn't say anything. She just stared at her father's body and breathed quickly and shallowly. She only seemed to know where she was when Augustus got there and woke her up. She fell into her brother's arms with a shuddering gasp. The cops got there in less than an hour. The roads were still muddy from the rain, and their cars had a hard time getting up the long drive to the manor. Detective Albert Cavendish, the lead investigator, was called away from dinner because the case was so serious. He was 45 years old, had gray hair that was too early for him, and was very organized. He was used to going to the homes of rich people. During his 20 years with the police department, he had looked into many crimes in the mansions along the Hudson, but not many murders. Officer James Sullivan, a young assistant, and Dr. Henry Morris, a police doctor, came with Cavendish. Augustus Rotors met them at the door. He had put on a mask of serious dignity, even though there was a lot of chaos going on inside. He took them straight to the library, where Thaddeus's body was still there, guarded by pale-faced footmen who stood at attention by the door. Detective Cavendish saw a violent end to a life of luxury. Thaddeus Rotors was lying on his back with the silver letter opener stuck in the hilt just below his sternum. The detective saw that the victim's hands didn't have any defensive wounds, and that there were no signs of a fight in the room. The murder weapon, which had the Rotors family crest on the handle, was part of the desk set that Thaddeus had fallen on before. While Detective Cavendish looked over the scene, the family stayed in the grand salon. The groundskeeper had turned away the dinner guests at the gate because they had heard about a family emergency. The detective noticed that the butler, Prescott Hargrove, was missing as the rain began to fall. Everyone agreed that he should have been in charge of how the household dealt with the crisis. "Where is the butler?" Cavendish asked Mrs. Winters, who was in charge of talking to the family while Hargrove was away. "We don't know, sir," she said, twisting her apron. "He disappeared not long ago. It's not like him at all before it happened." Officer Sullivan started searching the manor by carefully going through each room of the large house. The staff whispered to each other, and a lot of them crossed themselves as the thunder rolled outside. People used to talk about Ravencroft's supposedly haunted past as harmless gossip, but after the tragedy that night, those stories took on a darker meaning. Eventually, they found Hargrove in his room, sitting in a chair by the window that looked out over the garden. As you would expect from a man in his position, the room was neat and tidy, with everything in its place. There was only one lamp on the desk, and it lit up an open journal next to a fountain pen that wasn't capped. The butler didn't turn when Sullivan came up to him. He stayed still with his hands in his lap and a blank look on his face. "Mr. Hargrove?" the officer asked, but there was no answer. He gently touched the butler's shoulder, but the butler was stiff, and his muscles were tense under the well-tailored uniform. Sullivan called for Detective Cavendish, who quickly realized that Hargrove was in a state of catatonic shock. He wasn't responding to questions or commands, and was staring at something far away through the rain-streaked window. "Soldiers coming back from the war have done this before," Dr. Morris said in a low voice. "Something has shocked his system so deeply that his mind has just shut down. He could get better in hours or days, or he might never get better." Cavendish said this while looking at the open journal. There was only one line of neat writing on the page: "May God forgive what I have failed to prevent." The investigation that followed showed that the household was full of secrets, the family was broken by grudges, and the staff was held together by loyalties and fears that went beyond their jobs. People thought Thaddeus Rotors had been murdered, but the details of his death were still unclear. The medical examiner said that the deadly wound had been made with a lot of force, which could mean either a lot of physical strength or a lot of emotional motivation. We talked to each member of the Rotors family separately. Their stories were mostly the same, but they differed in some important ways. Constance, who was heavily sedated by her doctor, could only say things like, "I can't believe this," and "I'm shocked." Augustus talked about a father who had been busy with a business deal that he wouldn't talk about, even with his son. Eleanor, Augustus's wife, had been in her rooms all day with a headache and couldn't help. Sylvia, who found the body, couldn't remember anything that happened between going into the library and seeing her father's body. The staff was also talked to a lot. Their stories showed that the tension in the house had been rising over the past few months. People noticed a few changes in Thaddeus's behavior. He was more irritable. He was up late in the East Wing, and he had quiet conversations with Constance that stopped when servants came near. Most troubling were reports of strange visitors who came to the manor without being introduced and often stayed behind closed doors with Thaddeus late into the night. Hargrove, the loyal servant, who might have known a lot about the family's private life, stayed quiet. He was sent to a mental hospital in Albany, where he was diagnosed with severe depression with cataleptic features. The doctors there didn't have much hope for his recovery. They said that his condition seemed to get worse every day at sunset, and during those times he would mutter things that didn't make sense and struggle against his restraints, his eyes wide with fear at something only he could see. The New York press paid a lot of attention to the case. The Rotors family's wealth, along with the strange circumstances of Thaddeus's death and the Butler's strange state, caused a stir. Headlines screamed about murder in high society and insanity at Ravenscraft Manor. Journalists set up camp at the estate's gates in the hopes of seeing family members or talking to staff. Their work didn't get them much more than old rumors and crazier theories. Reporters made wild guesses, saying that the problems could be due to anything from business rivalries gone wrong to romantic relationships to occult practices. A tabloid published a very sensational story that said Thaddeus had been doing strange experiments in the East Wing. The story used anonymous sources who said they had seen strange deliveries of equipment and heard strange noises at night. The real news stories called these claims lurid fantasy and instead focused on Thaddeus's business ties and possible financial reasons for his murder. The family went behind the high walls of Ravenscraft and refused to talk to anyone except their lawyers. 2 weeks after the murder, the family released a statement saying how sad they were and asking for privacy while they mourned. It also offered a large reward for information that would lead to the arrest of Thaddeus's killer, but many people saw this as a formality rather than a real attempt to solve the case. The investigation stopped after 6 months. Even though many family members were suspected, no charges were brought against them. Augustus Rotors took over the family's business interests and handled the changeover surprisingly well, given how much he used to listen to his father. He oversaw the sale of some of Thaddeus's less well-known investments, and the money from those sales was put into more traditional investments with good reputations. Constance went to a part of the manor that staff and guests rarely saw. Marguerite, her lady's maid, became her main link to the rest of the house, bringing her meals and messages. People who saw Constance said she looked older than she was, and her once beautiful face had lost its shine because of grief or something else. She spent hours looking out her window at the river, and sometimes she would talk to herself as if she were talking to someone who wasn't there. Sylvia, who found her father's body, became withdrawn and spent hours alone in the library where the murder happened, as if she were looking for answers in the leather-bound books. She became interested in her father's collection of rare books about ancient mysticism and religions that had been forgotten and were now gathering dust on the highest shelves. The new housekeeper, who was supposed to clean the library, said that she had found Sylvia sleeping among the books several times, and her face looked troubled even in her sleep. In April 1921, the New York Tribune got an envelope with the editor's name on it. It had a journal inside, and the pages were filled with neat, beautiful writing. The note that came with it, which was not signed, said, "The Truth About Ravenscraft." The journal belonged to Prescott Hargrove and covered the years he worked for the Rotors family, from 1893 until Thaddeus's death in 1920. Malcolm Jennings, the publisher of the Tribune, saw the potential for a big story and gave their most secretive reporter, Jonathan Merrick, the job of reading the document. Merrick, who was 42 years old, had a good reputation for doing thorough research and reporting in an honest way, which was different from the sensationalism that was common in journalism at the time. He was given a private office to look over the journal and told to tell Jennings directly what he found. What Merrick found out over the next week would reveal a story that was much more disturbing than anything that had been written about it in the news. He worked late into the night, taking a lot of notes. Sometimes, he would stop to look out his window at the city lights below, as if he needed to see that everything was normal. In 1893, the year Hargrove started working at Ravenscraft, he started writing in his journal. The first few entries talked about a household that worked like wealthy American estates of the time, with the usual hierarchies and routines. Montgomery Rotors was shown to be a strict but fair boss, while his son Thaddeus was shown to be ambitious and a little ruthless when it came to business. The butler's observations were accurate, objective, and mostly about how to run the house. The journal kept track of the seasons at Ravenscraft, the family's social events, and the small dramas that happened between the staff. Hargrove wrote about Vivian Rotors' engagement and marriage, Augustus's time at Harvard, and how young Sylvia grew from a smart child into a talented young woman. Throughout these entries, his tone stayed professional, but he sometimes showed a fatherly pride in how well the household ran under his care. But as the years went by, the entries got more and more personal. Hargrove wrote down conversations he overheard, letters he saw, and behaviors he saw. He wrote about the tensions between Montgomery and Thaddeus, the illegal financial moves they made, and the elder Rotors' growing fear of what his son wanted to do. The butler's professional distance started to fade, and he began to worry and then feel morally conflicted in his private thoughts. The most disturbing entries started in 1912, after Montgomery died. Hargrove says that Thaddeus had been slowly changing his father's medication by giving him more and more laudanum to make him confused and dependent. People thought the old man's mental decline was due to age and stress, but it was really a planned effort to take away his control of the family's businesses. "I discovered the truth quite by accident," Hargrove wrote in September 1912. "While arranging Mr. Montgomery's evening medication, I observed Mr. Day, Thaddeus, entering his father's private dispensary. He did not see me in the connecting dressing room. I watched as he carefully measured an additional quantity of laudanum into the prepared dose, nearly doubling what Dr. Reynolds had prescribed. When confronted later that evening, he claimed it was at his father's request to help him sleep more deeply. The look in his eyes as he spoke chilled me to my core." Hargrove had known but remained silent, bound by what he described as his position and duty. His journal expressed conflict between his loyalty to the elder Rotors and his obligation to serve the household regardless of who headed it. He justified his silence by noting that Montgomery had received proper medical care and had not suffered physically despite the induced confusion. The old man had passed peacefully in his sleep, his death attributed to natural causes by the family physician. "Perhaps it was a mercy," Hargrove wrote after Montgomery's funeral. "He was spared knowing the full extent of his son's betrayal. Yet, I cannot escape the feeling that in my silence, I have become complicit in something that extends beyond this single act. There is a darkness in Mr. Thaddeus that I have glimpsed only in fragments, like shadows seen from the corner of one's eye. I fear what might emerge should it ever fully manifest." The entries following Thaddeus's assumption of control documented a gradual transformation of Ravenscraft. Staff loyal to Montgomery were dismissed on various pretexts, replaced by individuals who seemed notably incurious and deferential to their new employer. The household became more isolated from neighboring estates, declining invitations and rarely extending their own. Thaddeus initiated renovations, sealing off certain rooms in the East Wing and creating new spaces that served unclear purposes. Hargrove noted regular deliveries of unusual equipment, precision instruments from Switzerland, chemicals from specialized laboratories in Germany, books in ancient languages from antiquarian dealers across Europe. These items were taken directly to the East Wing, with strict instructions that staff were not to enter without explicit permission. When questioned about these acquisitions by his wife, Thaddeus described them as investments in the family's future prosperity. Most concerning were Hargrove's observations about Constance Rotors after her marriage to Thaddeus in 1914. Initially vivacious and socially active, she became increasingly withdrawn. The butler wrote down times when staff members didn't see her for days, when she would come out pale and confused. He noted her sudden interest in esoteric subjects and her collection of artifacts with supposed mystical properties, encouraged by her husband. An entry from November 1916 said, "Mrs. Rotors was not home for 3 days. When she got home, she went straight to her room and refused all meals. When her lady's maid came in to check on her, she found Mrs. Rotors in the bath. The water was pink. Mrs. Rotors said she had scratched herself on her jewelry, but Marguerite didn't see any injuries. What worried her more were the strange symbols drawn in powder on the dressing table mirror. When asked about them, Mrs. Rotors said she didn't know what they were, which made Marguerite cry. The children, too, figured prominently in Hargrove's account. Vivian, the oldest, had cut ties with the family after a fight with her father in 1915 that Hargrove didn't go into detail about. The butler only said that she had left Ravenscroft in tears, promising never to come back while her father was alive. She kept that promise, even though her mother and siblings begged her to come back. Augustus was described as becoming his father's shadow, adopting his mannerisms and business practices while displaying an unsettling lack of independent thought. Hargrove wrote down late-night meetings in Thaddeus's study where father and son talked in hushed tones about the process and the succession. After these meetings, Augustus often looked tired and needed help getting to his rooms, while Thaddeus seemed full of energy, with bright eyes that the butler found unsettling. Sylvia, sent to Switzerland in 1918, ostensibly to complete her education, returned in early 1920, transformed from a spirited young woman to a subdued figure who moved through the house like a ghost. Hargrove said that right after she got back, Thaddeus locked her up in the East Wing for a week and only let himself and Constance take care of her. When she finally came out, the butler had a hard time putting into words how she had changed. It is not merely a matter of increased maturity or the refined manners one might expect from her European education, he wrote. Miss Sylvia's essence has changed in a fundamental way. Her movements, which used to be fluid and expressive, are now deliberate and almost mechanical. Her voice, while still recognizable, has strange cadences. Her eyes are the most disturbing part. They watch with a calculating awareness that reminds me of Mr. Thaddeus when he is most focused. The entries that were most damaging were about what happened in October 1920. According to Hargrove, Thaddeus had become increasingly erratic in the preceding weeks, holding meetings late into the night with individuals who arrived without formal introduction and departed before dawn. The butler documented strange sounds emanating from the sealed East Wing and staff complaints of insomnia and disturbing dreams that they attributed to the unusual tensions within the household. Jenkins, the second footman, gave notice today, read an entry from early October. When pressed for his reasons, he confessed that he could no longer sleep in the servants' quarters due to what he described as voices in the walls. He claimed to hear chanting in a language he could not identify, always between 2 and 4 in the morning. I have heard no such sounds myself, but 3 maids have reported similar experiences in the past week. I have arranged for Jenkins to be paid a generous severance, with the understanding that he will attribute his departure to a family emergency. On the day of the murder, Hargrove described overhearing a heated exchange between Thaddeus and an unidentified visitor in the library. The conversation, conducted in hushed tones that the butler strained to discern from the adjoining room, included references to the process and irreversible consequences. When Hargrove entered with afternoon tea, the visitor was concealed behind a newspaper, and Thaddeus dismissed the butler with unusual abruptness. Later that afternoon, Hargrove observed Constance entering the library with a leather portfolio. He saw that her face showed terrible determination, as if she were about to do something she had been dreading for a long time. She remained with her husband for 27 minutes, exiting with the portfolio but without the contents it had contained. The butler described her passing him in the corridor. her eyes vacant, murmuring something that sounded like, "It's done." The final entry, written shortly before Hargrove was found catatonic, contained a confession of sorts. The butler admitted to entering the library after discovering Thaddeus's body, but before alerting the household. He said that he opened a secret compartment in the desk that only he and the master of the house knew about and took out a stack of papers. These papers, according to Hargrove, contained evidence of transactions so abhorrent that their very existence corrupts those who know of them. The ledger documented exchanges that cannot be expressed in financial terms, names of individuals, some familiar from society pages, others unknown to me, paired with dates, locations, and cryptic notations. Beside each entry, a measure of essence recorded with clinical precision. The most recent entry, dated yesterday, contains Sylvia's name, with a notation that the vessel is prepared and the transfer imminent. The butler wrote that he had burned these documents in his room, watching as the evidence of 30 years of accumulating darkness turned to ash. He described a sense of being observed as the papers burned, as if the very names recorded in those pages had summoned attention from whatever power Thaddeus had served through his transactions. His last written words expressed neither regret nor satisfaction, but a weary acceptance. "What I have seen cannot be unseen. What I know cannot be unknown. The silence I have maintained has made me complicit. May God have mercy on what remains of my soul." Jonathan Merrick had to go through a lot of banking records, property transactions, and medical reports to find out what the journal was saying. He found out that Montgomery Rotors had really had a cognitive decline that couldn't be explained before he died, even though doctors said it was due to natural causes. He confirmed that Thaddeus had done shady things with money, like buying properties from people who were going through personal problems for a fraction of their value. Merrick's most important discovery was that Rotors had ties to a number of people who had gone missing from high-profile positions in New York society. People made up stories about sudden trips or health-related retreats to explain these disappearances, which were never reported to the police. In each case, Rotors had later taken control of their business interests through complicated legal agreements that held up to surface-level scrutiny. The journalist found a pattern of Thaddeus's investments in little-known research, mostly in areas related to longevity and what one document called energy transference. Thaddeus had paid for private labs, sponsored academic positions for people who wanted to study strange subjects, and put together a private library of rare books on topics from ancient mysticism to new ideas in psychology and neurology. Merrick told Detective Cavendish about what he had found, even though Cavendish had not officially been working on the Ravencraft case. They put together a theory that Thaddeus Rotors had been blackmailing people on a regular basis, using information he got from a large network of servants, business partners, and social connections. It was unclear what kind of blackmail material it was, but both men thought it was something personal that would have ruined reputations and families if it got out. "Blackmail explains the money side," Cavendish said during one of their meetings in his sparsely furnished office at the police station. "But that doesn't explain Hargrove's extreme reaction, or the use of the words essence and transference. What was Rotors really doing in that East Wing? No one knew who had killed Thaddeus. Constance, Augustus, and Sylvia all had reasons and chances to do it. No one who was at the manor that day could be ruled out as a suspect. The murder weapon, a silver letter opener with the Rotors family crest, had been wiped clean of fingerprints, which suggests that it was not a crime of passion but a planned act. The standards and methods used in 1921 limited forensic evidence, so Cavendish and Merrick had to rely mostly on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. They paid more and more attention to Sylvia, whose discovery of the body and behavior afterward suggested that she was more involved than her family admitted. Staff members said that she had been in her rooms all afternoon before the murder, coming out only a short time before it happened. During the important time, no one knew where she was, and her claim that she had gone to the library to pick out music for the evening seemed strangely ordinary, given how tense the house had been that day. A fire broke out at Ravencraft Manor in May 1921, before Merrick could publish his results, or Cavendish could officially reopen the case. The fire started in the East Wing and quickly spread throughout the building, thanks to the old wooden beams under the stone facade. By the time firefighters from nearby towns got there, the main house was completely on fire. 3 servants died in the fire because they couldn't get off the upper floors. Early reports say that the family was at a concert in New York City and not home when the fire started. Further investigation showed that this wasn't completely true. Constance and Augustus had been in the city, but Sylvia had stayed at Ravenscraft because she was said to have a migraine. People thought she might have escaped or not been in the house when the fire started because her body was not found in the ruins. There were no signs of her in the woods or river nearby, and no one saw her leave the estate. It was never clear where the fire started. The official report said that an electrical problem or an unattended candle was probably to blame, but several firefighters said that the fire's intensity and spread pattern suggested that it started in more than one place. One person called the burning manner a deliberate pyre, consuming itself from within. Another person said they saw a figure watching the fire from the edge of the woods, but they couldn't tell who it was because of the darkness and smoke. The remains of Ravenscraft looked like a blackened skeleton for a few years. They could be seen from the river as a warning or a memorial. The stone walls, which were burned but still strong, fought off attempts to tear them down. They stood out against the sky as plants slowly took back the land around them. Local kids came up with complicated dares that involved getting close to the ruins, but not many of them were brave enough to go past the rusty gates at night. After the fire, Constance Rotors moved to Paris and settled into a beautiful apartment near the Luxembourg Gardens. She lived a quiet life, staying away from the social circles of expats and rarely having visitors. People who knew her said she was older than her years and would sometimes get confused and talk about Thaddeus as if he were still alive, or events from decades ago as if they had just happened. She passed away in 1937. Her funeral was mostly attended by distant relatives and representatives of charities to which she had left a lot of money in her will. Augustus kept the family's business interests going with some success, but he never reached the same level of fame or wealth as his father. He lived in Manhattan and had a summer home in Newport. He carefully built relationships in New York society that his father had ignored. People who knew him said that as he got older, he looked more and more like Thaddeus, not just in how he looked, but also in how he acted and spoke. He died without any children in 1952, which effectively ended the Rotors family line. His large estate was split up among different charitable foundations, according to the terms of a will that was made years before he died. There was never an official search for Sylvia Rotors, dead or alive. Reports of sightings came up from time to time over the years. In London in 1925, in San Francisco in 1933, and in a small village in Mexico in 1940. None of them were confirmed. Her disappearance is still one of the biggest mysteries in the Ravenscraft case, and it has led to a lot of speculation about what happened to her and what role she may have played in the events of that October night. The full journal of Prescott Hargrove, which started Merrick's investigation, was never published. After talking to lawyers, the Tribune's publisher decided that the risk of libel claims from people still alive who were mentioned in the document was greater than its journalistic value. Merrick was allowed to publish an article about the case that was heavily edited. The article hinted at but did not say directly what were the most shocking parts of Hargrove's story. The journalist was haunted by the case for the rest of his life, and he kept working on it as a personal project long after public interest had faded. He put together a huge archive of newspaper clippings, property records, and personal stories about the Rotors family. It took up a whole room in his small Brooklyn home. When asked about his ongoing research, he called it unfinished business, which made his coworkers notice how obsessed he was with the case. The butler never got better from being catatonic. He stayed in an institution until he died in 1924, and he never spoke again. Hargrove's doctor said that he seemed to go through times of extreme distress when he would stare blankly at empty corners of his room with a look of sheer terror on his face. He only made a low moaning sound that started at sunset and lasted until he was given medicine to help him sleep. Hospital records showed that his body got weaker over time while his mind stayed stuck in the horror that had taken over him on the night of the murder. Visitors were few and far between. Occasionally, former co-workers from Ravenscraft would come by, and Augustus Rotors would come by every 3 months to make sure Hargrove got the best care possible, even though the doctors thought his condition was hopeless. During the demolition of the psychiatric hospital where Hargrove had been held in 1968, workers found a sealed envelope hidden in a crack in the wall of his old room. There was one page in the envelope that was written in the butler's own handwriting and said, "To whoever finds this." The message, which was sent 2 weeks before his death, was short but scary. People think I'm quiet because I've lost my mind. In reality, I'm quiet because I've found it. What happened at Ravenscraft was beyond human malice. The Rotors didn't just get rich, they also took souls. The ledgers I burned didn't have financial transactions, they had spiritual ones. Thaddeus didn't die by human hand. He died because of whatever remnant of cosmic justice still works in this fallen world. I've seen the faces of those who were sacrificed for the family's prosperity. They still watch me. They wait in the shadows, and they hunger for those who served them in life. People thought this document was just the ramblings of a crazy person, so they put it in the county records and left it there until a graduate student looking into regional history found it in 1992. At that point, Ravenscraft was just a local legend, a story told to scared kids and curious tourists who came to the Hudson Valley. But there are still questions about what really happened in that mansion on the Hudson. The Rotors family's strange way of getting rich is backed up by financial records. Medical records show that Constance's health is getting worse, and that she is sometimes very tired. Architectural plans show the strange changes Thaddeus made to the manor, such as rooms that can only be reached through hidden passages and areas that don't seem to have a purpose. The most convincing evidence is the testimony of Maria Winters, the head housekeeper, which was recorded by a local historical society in 1947. Then, Winters, who was an old woman living in a church-run home, talked about what it was like at Ravenscraft in the months leading up to Thaddeus's death. The house had changed. You could feel it in the walls and the air. Rooms that had always been warm would turn cold for no reason. Staff would hear conversations in empty rooms. Young maids would refuse to work in the East Wing, saying that someone was watching them from the corners. Mr. Hargrove tried to keep things in order, but even he seemed to be affected. One time, I found him standing in the main hall at 3:00 inches the morning, staring up at the family portraits and whispering, "I know what you've done," over and over. When I asked if he needed help, he looked at me like I was a stranger and then walked away without saying anything. Winters also talked about how Sylvia had come back from Switzerland and how her behavior had changed in small ways. Miss Sylvia was always full of life and laughter. But when she came back, something was off. She smiled, but it never reached her eyes. She would spend hours in her father's library, reading those strange books he collected. Once I came into dust and saw her tracing symbols on the carpet with her finger and saying words that didn't sound like any language I knew. When she saw me, she said she was practicing her penmanship. But what kind of penmanship does one practice on a carpet? Winters' story about the night before the murder was probably the most disturbing. I was bringing fresh linens to the guest rooms when I passed Mr. Rotors' study. The door was ajar, and I heard him speaking with Miss Sylvia. He told her, "The transfer must be completed tomorrow. We've waited too long already." She asked, "Will it hurt?" And he laughed, not his normal laugh, but something cold that made me shiver. He said, "Only for a moment. Then you'll be everything we've prepared you to be." I hurried away then, not wanting to be caught listening. But that night, I prayed for Miss Sylvia. Something in his voice frightened me more than anything I'd ever heard in that house. Winters said that after the fire, she saw a figure standing among the ruins of the main house while she was gathering the few things she had saved from the servants' quarters that had partially survived. She thought the figure was Sylvia, and there was a shimmer in the air around it, like heat rising from pavement in the summer. When Winters yelled, the figure turned to look at her. The face was both Sylvia's and not Sylvia's, as if someone else were wearing her features. The figure disappeared before Winters could get close. The former housekeeper said that Hargrove had saved her from the fire by appearing to her in a dream the night before and telling her to sleep in the gardener's cottage because the house must be cleansed. She did this, even though she didn't know why she should. When asked why she had never told the police about this story, Winters said, "Who would believe an old woman's dreams? And besides, some truths are better left buried in the ashes." After a while, The ruins of Ravenscraft were cleared away, but the land stayed undeveloped for decades because locals thought it was unlucky. A real estate developer bought the land in 1980 and planned to build high-end homes with views of the Hudson. During the first digging, workers found a sealed chamber under what used to be the east wing of the manor. The chamber was about 12 feet square and had a stone altar, candle remnants, and walls with symbols on them that an archaeologist from Columbia University said were similar to those used in some occult practices in Europe in the late 1800s. What was most important, though, was finding a hidden compartment in the altar that held a leather-bound book. This book, written by Thaddeus Rotors and compared to known samples, described rituals meant to move essence and vital energy from one person to another. The text cited earlier works and had notes about both successful and failed attempts at these transfers. The last entry, dated the 13th of October, 1920, the day before Thaddeus died, said, "All is ready for Sylvia's ascension." The developer gave up on the project after finding these things out and after a string of accidents that happened during the early stages of the work. The equipment stopped working for no clear reason. Workers said they heard strange noises and felt like they were being watched. The most worrying thing was that the project foreman died for no apparent reason. He was found in the dug-up chamber one morning with a look of terror on his face, but no one could figure out what had happened. The property was eventually given to a conservation trust, which keeps it as a nature preserve. There is a small sign near the entrance that talks about the site's historical importance without going into detail about its darker sides. In 2012, a nursing home in Arizona said that Sarah Rhodes, a resident who had lived there since 1998, had died. It was thought that the woman was well over 100 years old, but her exact age could not be determined. She had no known family. After she died, staff found a box with some of her things that had newspaper clippings about the Ravenscraft case, a silver letter opener with the Rotors family crest, and a picture of Sylvia Rotors. There was a note on the back of the picture that said, "The vessel changes, but the essence remains. 1920. Local officials tried to look into this possible link to the historical case, but they found that most records about Sarah Rhodes before she got to the facility were either missing or clearly made up. Her fingerprints didn't match any known records, and DNA testing showed strange results that the lab technician said were consistent with contaminated samples, but they couldn't find a source of contamination. The doctor who had been in charge of Rhodes's care wrote in his final report that even though she was very old, she had shown amazing mental clarity and often talked about historical events as if they had happened to her. He also wrote down that she would watch the sunset from her window every night and whisper what sounded like, "Thank you, Prescott," as it got dark. The letter opener that Rhodes owned was sent to the New York Historical Society, where it became part of the small collection of items that are still around that are connected to the Rotors family and Ravenscraft Manor. Researchers said it looked like the murder weapon that killed Thaddeus Rotors, but they couldn't prove it for sure. A metallurgical analysis showed that the tool was made in the late 1800s, and the quality of the work was typical of expensive items made for rich families at the time. The most disturbing thing was what a conservator found while cleaning the artifact. When the handle was put under strong light, there were signs of a substance in the fancy engravings. At first, tests showed that the material was blood, but because it was so old, modern methods should not have been able to find it. The technician who was doing the tests had an unexplained seizure while handling the sample, which cut off further analysis. After he got better, he asked to be moved to a different project and refused to talk about what had happened, only saying that he had seen something that should not exist. Time, deliberate hiding, and the destruction of evidence have made it hard to know what really happened at Ravenscraft. Something more than normal, human evil happened inside those walls. It turned a butler who was known for being calm into a silent witness haunted by invisible beings. It may have pushed a young woman to kill her father, and maybe even helped her live much longer than she should have. The Hudson River still flows past the empty promontory where Ravenscraft used to be. Some people who visit the nature preserve say they have seen a woman near the ruins at sunset or heard a woman's voice saying strange words on the wind. Park rangers say that these events are the result of people's imaginations being sparked by learning about the site's history. They do say, though, that electronic devices often stop working near where the East Wing used to be, and that animals stay away from the area even when the weather is bad and they would normally look for shelter. People who look into the Ravencraft case usually do so from one of three points of view: as a historical murder mystery, with normal explanations involving family dynamics and money; as a psychological study of how people can be deluded and how suggestion can work in small groups; or, most controversially, as proof of practices that go beyond what most people think of as reality. Advocates of the initial viewpoint highlight the recorded conflicts within the Rotors family, the dubious financial transactions, and the recurring behavior of control and manipulation displayed by Thaddeus. They say that Sylvia, who was traumatized by what happened in Switzerland or when she got back to Ravencraft, killed her father in a moment of crisis, possibly with the help of her mother or brother. In this view, she planned her own escape from justice and used her family's resources and connections to do so. The second viewpoint focuses on how closed off the household at Ravencraft was, where isolation and hierarchy made it easy for everyone to have shared mental health problems. Advocates of this perspective assert that Thaddeus's fascination with esoteric topics shaped the household's interpretation of events, establishing a context in which mundane occurrences were perceived as supernatural. According to this analysis, Hargrove's breakdown was caused by the cognitive dissonance between how he understood the world and the different reality that was created inside the manor. The third perspective is held by a small but dedicated group of researchers who contend that the Ravencraft case exemplifies practices that influenced forces beyond standard scientific comprehension. They point to the documented physical effects, such as inexplicable cold spots, equipment failures, and strange substance analyses, as proof that whatever Thaddeus Rotors started in the East Wing had effects that went beyond the mental level. This point of view is still not widely accepted in academic circles, but it continues to interest people who study historical accounts of the paranormal. Jonathan Merrick may have the last word on the Ravencraft case because he kept looking into it off and on throughout his career as a journalist. He wrote in his private journal in 1965, just before he died, "I have spent decades seeking rational explanations for what happened to the Rotors family and their faithful Butler. I have constructed and discarded dozens of theories involving human motives, greed, revenge, fear, desire. None fully account for the evidence or for the profound sense of wrongness that permeates every aspect of the case. I am left with a disturbing conclusion. Some boundaries should not be crossed. Some knowledge should not be sought. Some ambitions should not be fulfilled. Thaddeus Rotors discovered this too late. Hargrove understood it in time to act, though at the cost of his sanity. And Sylvia, if my suspicions are correct, continues to bear the consequences of her father's transgressions, neither fully alive nor truly dead, caught between worlds as surely as Ravencraft itself stood between earth and sky on its promontory above the Hudson. There are ancient hungers in this world that transcend our modern understanding. They wait patiently for those whose ambition and arrogance open doors best left closed. The wealthy believe their fortunes can protect them from consequences. The Rotors learned otherwise. Their true legacy is not their lost fortune or their burned mansion, but a warning written in ashes and blood. Some prices are too high, even for those who can afford anything. Merrick's words are a warning for anyone who might be tempted to look too deeply into the mysteries that are just beyond our understanding. The Ravencraft case serves as a stark reminder that wealth and power cannot protect against certain forms of retribution, that some secrets exact their own toll on those who keep them, and that the silent testimonies of loyal servants may harbor truths more horrific than we are willing to confront. Prescott Hargrove's ultimate loyalty, whether to the family he served or to a higher principle of justice, is still unclear, just like what he saw in those last hours at Ravencraft. We know for sure that he took his secrets to the grave, leaving behind only broken pieces of evidence of the horrible truth that shattered his orderly world on that fall evening in 1920. The silence that fell over him afterward speaks more clearly than any confession, suggesting that some truths are better left hidden in the ashes of mansions that have burned down.